Good evening, everyone. I'm Nancy Fund. Welcome to the Bill Lane Center for the West and SEPR dinner, the State of the West dinner. It's our third annual dinner. We're going to have them every year going forward, and we're thrilled that you all have been here. I want to thank everyone for participating today in a series of discussions about very provocative and important issues confronting the West, and really giving us your insights and enthusiasm. For those of you that are new to the Center for the West, my shorthand way of describing what we do, and I'm the chair of the advisory council for the Bill Lane Center, my shorthand way of describing what we do is to paraphrase the very famous quote from the writer Wallace Stegner in describing the West. And so what we try to do is to build a society to match the scenery. Our mission is to advance scholarly and public understanding of the past, present, and future of Western North America by supporting research, teaching, and reporting on Western land and life in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And you saw that so specifically today, the trio of U.S., Canada, and Mexico. We approach this task from a very multidisciplinary vantage point. We integrate history and culture, the environment and natural resources, and economics and public policy. If you participate in our seminars and meetings, which I hope you will likely learn from a Native American elder, a Supreme Court justice, and an esteemed Western poet, all under the same roof. It's just a fabulous interdisciplinary approach that we have, and the people are fantastic. And tonight is no exception. Tonight we have John Hickenlooper, who is the governor of the glorious state of Colorado, to address us. And I'm so excited because Governor Hickenlooper is a proven and highly respected leader and runs the state that is in many ways a microcosm of the West. Colorado is both blue and red. It's rural and it's urban. It has mountains, it has plains, and an abundance of traditional and clean energy resources. It's a magnet for entrepreneurs in fields tech, biotech, sustainability, and it really attracts the talent to fuel those enterprises. So it's new and old industries in, as we know, a beautiful setting. Governor Hickenlooper personifies this hybrid state that he lives in. He is, as he likes to say, a recovering geologist, and he once owned a brew pub in Denver before being recruited to run for mayor of that city, and he was mayor for nearly 8 years. He became governor of the state of Colorado in 2011, and since then has led decisively on issues ranging from gun control to energy to education, and of course, more recently, disaster recovery. If you think that here in California we have complicated ballot measures, think again. I just looked at the internet a few days ago, and in the last election a few weeks ago in Colorado voters weighed in on, get this, education reform, marijuana taxes, fracking bans, and secession movements. Did I miss anything, John? Piece of cake. Somehow Governor Hickenlooper manages it all and brings people together to get things done. And last but not least, as the current head of the Western Governors Association, John is bringing his can-do, consensus-building approach to the part of the world that we love the best and that we call home. Please join me in welcoming Governor John Hickenlooper.
Thank you. So thank you for the kind introduction. We certainly don't have so eloquent or wise venture capitalists in Colorado. Actually, there are probably people here from Colorado. Take that out. Just pretend I didn't say that. Before I say anything, I want to recognize George Schultz, who I've had the pleasure of dining with, and I've met a couple of times. And I'm going to guess, like in every community, you don't appreciate sometimes just exactly the people you do have. And I can say, honestly, it is just an honor and a privilege to be able to spend some time with you. And you guys should, you know, please applaud. I bow down. I want to recognize also John Chauvin and David Kennedy for the work they do here at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research and the Bill Lane Center. And it is an honor and pleasure for me to be here. I want to set a little context about Colorado, just to make sure we get some facts. We'll come back to facts repeatedly, but as a frame of reference, if you could have an imaginary piece of silk and stretch it over the entire state of Colorado, and then magically it could drape over every mountain and fill every valley, and then you were to raise it up and stretch it out, Colorado is bigger than Texas, right? So, and in many ways, Colorado is on the cutting edge. Some people would call it the bleeding edge of many of the major issues of our day. I know this, you know, by being the mayor of Denver, and historically, the mayor and the city of Denver and the suburbs are at odds with each other, like in most major metropolitan areas, and the metropolitan area is at odds with the rural areas. I was the first mayor in 150 years to be elected the governor of Colorado, just as a frame of reference of how divisive some of these issues are. And you know, when I say that we're on the bleeding edge, part of it is that none of these issues happen in a vacuum. They're always kind of blending into each other. Energy issues are colored by an overreaching concerns about water and water quality and the environment. Our economic and business strategies end up being tied to immigration policy and then back to energy and water. There are obviously new realities based on legalized marijuana. Comes back to water and the environment. Obviously, the enduring debates about gun safety and gun legislation, and certainly whether, depending on how you look at it, the lack of gun legislation. As the chair of the Western Governors Association, as Nancy said, and some are Jim Ogsbury, who's our executive director, is back there, the head of the Western Governors Association. Thank you for coming out, being part of this. We realize that there are opportunities embedded in all these divisive issues, and that many of these issues are shared throughout the West. And Colorado is a place where we get it, in a way, we're almost a laboratory. We're still, our geography hasn't changed. We're a place of wide open spaces and long horizons. But our demography continues to change. The Hispanic population has grown dramatically. Certainly is a more potent political force. Seniors have moved west to retire, where there are more days of sunshine. They want to be closer to their kids. The kids flock for recreational opportunities. So another weird thing about Colorado in 2009, 10, and 11, when there were no jobs really anywhere in the country, more 25 to 34-year-olds moved to metropolitan Denver than any city in America. Not per capita, than any city in America. And that's indicative, really, of kids moving west. And as their parents retire, their parents follow them. We see a lot of the social changes in Colorado. So many young people. We were able to pass universal background checks on gun safety issues. It cost me about 16 points of approval rating. We did also pass civil unions for same-sex couples, college tuition for the children of undocumented parents. And these are things that would have really been unthinkable even 5 or 6 years ago. And I think these are all Western issues around water, energy, and immigration. And I think we can answer a bunch of these when we get to questions and answers, Q&A. But I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about energy. And you know, we're blessed in Colorado to have abundant energy resources. We have low sulfur coal, we have oil, gas, we have natural gas in abundance, renewable energies like wind and solar, some remarkable geothermal capacities. And I want to say, you know, right off, Colorado should be the place, and I think will be the place, where we demonstrate what renewable energy can look like in a comprehensive implementation. We signed legislation this last session expanding our renewable standard, which is one of the first in the country, to include our rural electrics and co-ops. Another issue to somewhat, well, significantly divisive. Last spring was really my effort to see if I could really piss everyone off. But while this, was that my outside voice? Sorry. You know, this was sufficiently divisive, and that's what led to a number of the communities threatening to secede, you know, making this, I know this is no news for California, because you were having Southern California threatening to secede for decades. But I think that, you know, and one way, you know, in a number of the communities, they voted against the cession, largely because the state grants all their water rights. And it suddenly became clear to the civic leaders that this would be an untenable solution. None of the issues, I think, are more divisive than the issues around fracking. And, you know, with the new technologies, horizontal drilling, the access into getting access and really cost-effective recovery of hydrocarbons in ways we never could have done before. You know, 2 weeks ago when we had these elections, 3 of the 4 communities that had on their ballot the opportunity to either give a moratorium, but essentially ban fracking passed them. And I think in many ways Colorado is ground zero for this debate. And it's also something that is common. It has application in almost all the western states. And I think we are uniquely positioned to self-determine and really to lead even the entire country. As a recent shutdown made clear, you know, one of the great problems we have in Washington is the inability to collaborate towards a conclusion and then finally make a compromise. And I know many of you are from the private sector. You know, I spent 16 years in the restaurant business. I never sold a hamburger once that I didn't know it was worth about 50 cents more than what they'd pay for it, right? But you compromise. Your prices come down to what the customers will pay. It's a constant negotiation with your vendors, your contractors. Washington's lost this, and I think that the common sense that makes compromise possible is in far too short supply. And I could, you know, go on at great length on the reasons. I think part of it is the lack of people with business experience in government. And look down the list of people in the House of Representatives and how few have ever been in business, have ever signed both sides of the paycheck, have ever had to manage an enterprise. Once you're in a small business, for 2 weeks you learn that you know, if you don't treat that customer with respect, no matter how unreasonable, they'll go out and poison your reputation for months before you even find out about it and find out that they're distorting the truth or making up lies. In business, you would never try to put down your opponent thinking you're raising yourself up, but that's what happens every day in politics. Negative ads, I mean, they tie into this. And again, negative ads work, but you never see Coca-Cola doing an attack ad against Pepsi, because Pepsi would do an attack ad back, Coke would attack, Pepsi would counterattack. You depress the entire product category of soft drinks. Well, what we're doing is we're depressing the entire product category of democracy with all the attack ads in politics. People turn off the TV, they don't read the newspaper, they tune it out at our own peril. And I think that really comes back to when you have issues like fracking. It really is a challenge if people aren't willing to take the time to get the facts. I have a son, I'm a late bloomer in many ways, and my son Teddy got into an argument last spring. He was in 5th grade and complaining about life, and I was telling him how great it was. And the argument took a dramatic turn for the worse. And Teddy looked at me and he goes, "Daddy, what do you do at work each day that's so hard? You make decisions." I said, "Well, Teddy, yeah, Daddy, get the facts, make a decision, check, next." I said, "So, well, Teddy, it's not really," No, Daddy, get the facts, make a decision, check, next." And he says, "Every day I've got to go into school and learn something completely new I didn't even know existed the day before. If I don't get it completely right, my next day is misery. Everything's based on the day before." And, after about 15 minutes, I gave up. Fifth grade is harder than being governor, right? There's no question. But the next day, as often happens with Teddy, the next day I thought of what I should have said. And that is that we don't all have the same facts anymore, right? We don't have Walter Cronkite or the Encyclopedia Britannica. And we spend too much time, arguing over what should be just which facts are facts and which ones aren't. And I think it's worth giving, and I know some of this was covered today, not all of it, I think, but there's some statistics that I always try to put out just as a frame of context when we start talking about, horizontal drilling and hydrologic fracking and the things that really led dramatically to inexpensive natural gas. So based on a study from the Lead School of Business at CU, the University of Colorado, the oil and gas industry in Colorado directly employs 51,000 people, right? Average wage is $74,000 per year. That's 50% higher than the average wage in the rest of the state. Basically about 3.8, almost $4 billion to Colorado households. Severance taxes to the state of $163 million, $273 million to the federal government, which there's a problem in those numbers as well, just let me say. If the federal government's getting half again more than we are. And I think none of this would happen without fracking. Literally, essentially, almost every well that's drilled today is almost every case there's fracking involved to get it up to productivity. There are about 420 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in the Rocky Mountain region, and I think that is the crux of this shale gas revolution that's changing the world. It has dramatically driven down energy costs in North America. The average cost in Colorado for a household for their energy use in their household, not in their transportation, is about $1,500. That's 25% less than other households. If you look at those communities where they use natural gas for heating in their homes, the actual savings per family is about $1,200 per family. That's poor families, rich families, everybody's on an average. I think that you go through, you look at their benefits, and it certainly says, all right, now what are the risks? And how do we mitigate those, or can we mitigate those? And I look at these from an entrepreneurial way. After I was a geologist for 5 years, and then the company got sold. We all got laid off. I got a big severance. Turned out I wasn't as good a geologist as I thought, so I had to, find other venues for my creative inclination. So I went from one liquid to another. I went into the brew pub business, and we ended up opening 16 brew pubs, always in historic buildings, always in downtowns. And I am at heart an entrepreneur, and I know that every entrepreneur sweats every penny, and I think that, driving down costs of energy really allows entrepreneurs to start businesses faster. You often wouldn't think this, but it creates more opportunities for them. And I think despite however much conservation we do, we're going to keep using more energy, right? We can slow the rate of that increase, but the global appetite for energy is not going to go away. And I think that, even in Colorado, our natural gas has the capacity to heat 18 million homes. We only have 5 million people in Colorado. And I think it allows us to begin really thinking about energy independence in a way that actually is something that could be delivered. I think if you step back and look at that as a parent, though, you've got to say, all right, what are the environmental impacts? And in many ways, it depends on how you compare natural gas, right? If it's compared to coal in terms of electrical generation, it emits half as much CO2. It reduces carbon monoxide and particulate emissions by up to 90%. It emits 80% less nitrogen oxide than coal, and virtually zero sulfur dioxide and obviously mercury, the neurotoxin. If you look at even though we never signed the Kyoto Agreement, the United States is essentially halfway towards compliance. Now, part of that is the economic recession, There are other reasons, but more than half of that decline in the per capita carbon emissions in this country were for the transition from coal-fired plants to natural gas plants. And again, looking at the world in the future, I mean, still a quarter of the planet is relying on wood and dung for their heat. There's going to be demand for all kinds of energy. And I think we obviously saw all four of the communities that banned fracking in Colorado were all in Boulder County. It's a county that any Democrat, and some people refer to me as a bad Democrat, but any Democrat, you're not going to do well in Colorado without support from Boulder. So we're very careful. You could say that Boulder and the University of Colorado is to environmentalists what Silicon Valley and Stanford is to technology entrepreneurs. Is that? Yeah, I'll say that. At the University of Colorado, one of our really most respected environmental engineering professors, Dr. Joe Ryan, laid out a way to assess the contents of frac fluid. And according to Ryan, of the 1,000 compounds that have been included in the inventories and lists of hydraulic fracking operations, very few number have the capability of harming humans. And what's more, that for these to pose a real hazard, the compounds would have to be persistent enough to avoid breaking down into something less hazardous as it travels towards humans. And certainly identifying the compounds with these qualities generates even less reason to be alarmed. Again, I want to point out that this is a Boulder professor saying this. And yet somehow there's a disproportionate level of fear and anxiety. The four communities that voted against and outlawed fracking are resistant because they are worried about danger to their water supply. In some cases, it's also a land use issue. They don't like an industrial process close. So I think part of the challenge is to how do we address the legitimate questions that these communities have. And I think the debates about climate change have to be science-based, and I am, trust me, I get it. I understand that climate change is occurring, but the battle that takes place in purple states like Colorado generally isn't constructive, basically because neither side listens or moves. And I tell people, just as a basic premise, I don't think my house is ever going to catch on fire, but I spend 1% of the value of my home every year to buy insurance. And if we were looking at our $15 trillion a year economy and saying we should spend 1% to make sure that we're not ruining our economy, it would be, I don't know, roughly 100 times more than we're spending now. And I think that framework allows us to get a little bit outside the he said, she said, I'm for it, you're against it, and get people back to the facts. And I think, we all need to make sure the public is informed. It used to be that communities had a strong local newspaper, relied source on television. Maybe not so much anymore. We've got a million blogs, a million agendas, some of them trustworthy, some of them not. And I think that means, to a certain extent, industry's got to play a more assertive role in being transparent. And yet, oftentimes, industry hasn't done that. And I think, this is where sometimes elected officials can step up. I remember 2.5 years ago, the New York Times did an expose on frac fluids and how dangerous they'd be. And my wife was reading the paper in the New York Times front page story and gave it to me in a huff. And I read through it, I said, well, this isn't true. And this is completely out of context. And this is a distortion. This isn't true. I mean, there's no example of frac fluid ever doing this and whatever. And I got through it, and I said, so you can see really there's not real substance here. And she goes, yeah, but it's the New York Times, right? And she was unmoved. And I think that was largely the industry never responding, not getting the facts out there. And I think it fuels the community's fears about the environmental impact and a sense of conspiracy. And obviously, there are often trade secrets that need to be protected, but at that time, the oil and gas industry wouldn't reveal their components. We had about 90%, we had a voluntary program, 90% of the wells drilled, the service companies revealed 90% of the components, but the public was obsessed with the other 10%. And I think, you know, why wouldn't the industry reveal that last 10%? There must be something there, and conspiracy theorists went wild. And I sat down with a number of the oil and gas people and said, we got to figure out how to get to full disclosure, because you're never going to win this. You're just going to alienate folks. One of the people I served on the board of the Denver Art Museum, a guy named Lanny Martin, was on the board of Halliburton. I mentioned this to him. Next thing I knew, literally 5 days later, Chairman and CEO Dave Lazar was in my office, and I was saying these same things to him, that we were losing the PR war. And it wasn't we. I mean, I looked at it as we, government, have to be a fair witness and make sure that the facts are out there. And so we had this long discussion, and I spent a fair amount of time with the Colorado Environmental Coalition, the Environmental Defense Fund. I talked to the leadership of the NRDC about, you know, why aren't we getting revelation and transparency around this? And so finally, Dave Lazar shows up this day, and he's a smart guy, very nice, very cordial, but very wary, right? Not a lot of trust. And it certainly wasn't trying to hide anything. And he even pointed out that their latest frac fluid was made completely of food additives, right? They couldn't do it commercially yet. It was a prototype, but everything had been passed by the FDA. And he said he was worried because he wanted to protect the proprietary information. Coke doesn't give away their magic formula. And I got the sense he was willing, but maybe wasn't sure he could trust the process. And so I mentioned that I heard one of his staffers had drunk frac fluid at a recent oil and gas conference in Colorado, and he said that he'd done it. And of course, he pulled out of his pocket a bottle of transparent, viscous fluid. He explained that this was their clean stimulant, the clean stim prototype that they were working on. So I looked at him and I said, so can I take a swig? And he stepped, you know, and it was a moment of trust, right? So I took a swig of this stuff. It was very thick. You know, I generally spend most of my professional life tasting beer, so it was a very different thing. But I think that from that moment on, the conversation changed, and that he began, you know, listening to how could we do this. And as he was leaving, we were talking about that even though Coke doesn't disclose the exact formula, they do reveal all the components. 6 months later, we went back and forth between the Colorado Environmental Coalition and the Environmental Defense Fund and Halliburton. And we had the chief operating officer from Halliburton and the head of the Rocky Mountain region of the Environmental Defense Fund, both standing at a press conference claiming credit. And we had sufficient transparency and got that done simply by taking the time to really listen and work hard at it. I think that our challenge we face now, I mean, our communities are understandably concerned about the noise and the smells, the sight of a drilling rig close to their homes. In Colorado, we have what's called the split estate. So the person who owns the mineral rights is not the same as who owns the surface. And our state constitution demands that those people have access to their minerals. And it's in our constitution. It's a terrible system. Let me guarantee anyone who's dealt with it. And I think we have to recognize that this transparency, which allows this industrial process to come closer to people's home, you know, has to be acknowledged, and people's concerns are valid. And we went, again, back to the oil and gas industry, and we said, we're going to have to use different criteria. And a lot of the smaller companies were adamant and furious, but we pushed, you know, the setbacks for wells from schools or hospitals, places of assembly, to 1,000 feet, which it had been 350 feet. We pushed it back to 500 feet even for, you know, rural farmhouses. But we also knew that we had more to go. Methane leakage, major component of climate change. Certainly and a major component of air pollution in many ways, and yet there are no rules, to my knowledge, in any state that talk about methane specifically. And I think we've been, the last 6 months, 7 months, we've been working back and forth, same process between the environmental community and the oil and gas industry to say, all right, what would an appropriate framework for regulation look like. So we set, maybe not this year, but within the next couple of years, 0 escapes, 0 methane that goes away. But how can we do that in the least expensive way possible for the oil and gas industry so that we're in no ways punitive? And I think at this point we've got a much higher level of trust, and I think we're going to get there. I think that we are, fairly close to being able to announce that we will have a regulatory set of rules that are going to address fugitive methane and other escape volatiles in a way that lead to greater trust with the public. We continue to look at every option we can to go to, and I go out there sometime and the citizens they've thrown eggs at me, they beat on the car with their placards. When people are worried about their environment, they take it very, very seriously, as I think any of us would. I'm not sure we'd all throw eggs. But I think that reality requires all of us, and certainly those of us in elected office, to step it up. And I think we went out to Detroit a year and a half ago with Governor Fallon from Oklahoma. She's a Republican, I'm a Democrat. And I think natural gas is a wonderful transition fuel. We're going to get to pure renewables soon enough. But in the meantime, we should be converting our cars until we get to, I got a tour of the Tesla factory yesterday. And he's had some difficult press. The whole time I was with Elon Musk, I kept saying, you shouldn't be with me. You need to go out and deal with the press. He said, no, I don't. I think I need to stay with you for just a little while. But we're not going to get to electric cars this year or next year, right? And getting more vehicles to run on compressed natural gas, again, as a transition fuel, it's about $1.25 a gallon cheaper. It burns much cleaner than refined crude, gasoline. And anyway, we went up to Detroit with Governor Fallon, and they literally couldn't believe that a Republican and a Democrat were actually working together on something. And I would offer up that some of these issues, and as we work towards a much more rigorous regulatory environment, as the chair of the Western Governors Association, part of our responsibility is to bring together Wyoming and Utah and Texas and all the Western states, which we have very similar geology overall, and say, how do we use best practices and make compromises so we can come up with one regulatory environment for the whole region, right? And allow that to be a template that maybe other regions in the country can use or not. But certainly make it easier to do the regulations and give the public a lot more confidence. Western governors, we're working now on also having a fleet of planes that we can get much more rapidly to fight wildfires when they first start. The one thing you learn, I'm sure you guys know it in California even better than we know it in Colorado, that the sooner you can get to a wildfire, the better your chances are of controlling it and containing it. If it gets going, you're sunk. And the goal, it's interesting. If you actually look at wildfires, they generally start in the south, in Arizona and New Mexico, and then they work over the course of the summer, work their way north. So there's no reason why each state should have their own airplanes, their own tankers to fight fires. It makes a lot more sense to do it on a regional basis. And I think that each of these issues, and I would go from water, Colorado's working on a state water plan. We're going to try and merge that plan with other states to have, again, a regional water plan, which, again, no one's ever done in this country. I think long overdue. A lot of this stuff isn't going to happen on the East Coast, and it isn't going to happen in the Midwest. It's only in the West, and there's that kind of wild, this kind of relentless sense of optimism and possibility that drew people here and have allowed people to succeed here. And I think, I'm not sure if you've adopted a motto for the symposium. If you have, certainly disregard this. What I'm going to suggest, if you haven't, Walt Whitman wrote a poem called Pioneers, Oh Pioneers, that might provide some inspiration. And to paraphrase Whitman, he wrote that we in the West have always been impatient and full of action, full of pride and friendship. We take up the task and the burden. So now rather than burden you anymore with me talking, let me answer some questions. Thank you.
You want to have a seat?
You know, I do need to sit down. I just got off crutches about a week ago. I had that hip, labrum surgery where it's like, 4 hours of surgery and then 8 weeks on crutches. One of my staff asked what happened to me that I needed hip surgery. And I said, if you put your foot in your mouth as often as I do, what would you expect?
Oh, very funny. But we're glad you're off your crutches. Do we have questions from the audience? I certainly have a bunch of questions, but let's hear from the audience. Well, while you're thinking of them, just the image of you drinking this viscous fracking fluid is imprinted on my mind. On the renewable side, it reminds me of the saying that the solar guys have, which is, a solar spill is just a really nice day.
I like that.
So have you had the same opportunity to kind of be so embedded in the development of the renewables industry in Colorado as you've had with fracking?
Oh, sure. I have several of my oldest friends, more larger scale installations. So when I was mayor of Denver, we did the largest installation at an airport, and I spent a lot of time out there on site seeing how it worked and trying to understand the economies. Certainly the dramatic, if you go back over 8 years, a dramatic reduction in cost is remarkable. And certainly wind, Colorado is, I think, third now in wind or fourth in wind generation, but we are right in the sweet spot. I think eventually we will be, certainly per capita. We had one day last spring where 62, in peak load, 62% of our energy was being generated by wind, which is insane.
Significant.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Actually, it might not have been peak load. Now I say that, I think it was in the evening, but
It's still a good percentage.
yeah.
Sir?
As a Westerner, I want to thank you for the leadership you've provided, not just for Colorado, but for the rest of the Western states. Having said that, on a positive note, I was very disappointed on the educational bond because I really thought that might show a way that we could get education back as being a primary focus that Westerners shared. Can you give us a after-the-fact analysis of what happened? Is it something that could be brought back? Is it something that really reflects an attitude that just seems to be anti-children, anti-education?
So this was Amendment 66, which was a tax increase, an income tax increase of 1.3%. Took us from 4.63 to 5.9%. I know that looks attractive to many of you. But what we did was it was a grand bargain. And we went to the teachers union and the school districts and we got them to give in things that they'd never given before. So this was going to have some of the easy stuff, quality early childhood education for every at-risk 4-year-old. It was going to allow us to have, to cut dropout rates by 33% in 7 years was our goal. And this was to be done by taking, about 80% of the dropouts have one of the three conditions, either extreme poverty, learning disabilities, or in Colorado, English language learners. And this was going to give $1,200 to $1,400 per condition, per kid per year. So some kids would have all three conditions. The school would get an extra $4,000 per kid like this per year, and the money goes directly to the schools, not to the school district. And for the first time in history, if the kid drops out, the school stops getting the money. For the rest of the year, they lose that. So there's an economic incentive for every principal to make sure those kids don't drop out. Never been done before. And it comes in with a website, a transparency website that allows parents to track every single dollar to every school every day, right? And see whether it goes to the pension, to the teachers, to the principal, to the bureaucracy of the school district. I mean, you want to empower parents and create choice and competition. It also made charter schools full equity partners so that they got equal dollars to all the things that teachers unions and school districts would always fight because this was going to put $1 billion a year more money into the system. They compromised, and so we had the Walton family put $1 million into supporting this. Michael Bloomberg put $1 million. Bill and Melinda Gates from their personal funds put $1 million. But the teachers union put $4 million into supporting this. These were strange bedfellows. So we had everyone together, but in Colorado, it was just too rich. And I think we ran the people that organized it probably didn't run the best campaign. But it really wasn't impossible in this political environment to do a tax increase, which for such a large initiative, people perceived it as impossible. And I believe in the impossible. I used to, when I ran for mayor, and I told this story in Vail last year at the energy conference, but I used to carry, I started out 3% in the polls when I ran for mayor, and I had this clipping from the Denver Post about a professor of public speaking trying to encourage her students to use opposites when they speak publicly. If you talk about the worst of times, you have to talk about the best of times. If you talk about the agony, you have to talk about the ecstasy. And she asked her class, what was the opposite of despair? The kid raised her hand and goes, joy? She goes, exactly. If you want people to feel despair, use joy in the same sentence. The words gain emotional impact by being together. Then she said, what's the opposite of woe? And the kid way in the back goes, giddy up! And so, but the beauty of that, in terms of like an education initiative like this, is that the opposite of woe is to giddy up. And you ask what our plan, well, so we're going to take the stuff that doesn't cost too much money, like the transparency, and we're going to go ahead and try and get that done, convince the school districts who were originally against it, but to let them, that we were going to come back and try and get more resources later, but let's show the public that we really do care about the kids and we care about the reforms, and we're going to keep going for it. So that's the plan.
Great. Other questions?
So, you talk about energy and natural gas and all that, and coal is always like the bad guy.
It's dirty.
Yeah, it's very dirty, but don't they have technology that actually cleans it before it comes out?
They're trying, and they're getting there, but even with the best scrubbers, it's still much dirtier than something like natural gas.
How is it economically speaking?
It's much less expensive. But the question is, how do you value all the externalities? So Colorado, we've had increasing levels of asthma, over the last 25 years, and basically they track almost identically to the increased coal we've had to burn in the West as population's grown. Is that scientifically accurate enough to say for sure? I don't know, but it's a pretty interesting, coincidence, and certainly if you live in a place like Denver that's a mile high, particulates in the air, and the new scrubbers get most of the particulates out, but certainly the SOx and the NOx, the LOX, the bagels, but all that stuff, it's not good for us, right? And especially people that have issues with their lungs. So when you begin factoring that stuff in, it gets very close to each other now, especially with natural gas under $4 an MCF. They track, a new coal plant, new natural gas plant, they track dead even. And to get to the really even something remotely close to EPA standards, you'd have to build you can't retrofit the old plants anymore. And I am all about, if someone can find clean coal, my environmental friends go nuts because they don't want coal at all. There's a way to burn coal cleanly and capture some of the methane and the carbon dioxide, these climate gases. Again, I try to stay out of the climate change thing, but even in the Senate, most people believe that climate change is occurring. And I think some of the issues you never read about, right? The acidification of the oceans. I mean, that's a steady rate of change right now that you extrapolate out. You don't have to go too far. Evolutionary biology is much slower than the acid levels of our oceans are becoming, which means literally in 50 or 100 years, we could have a significant drop in our harvesting of protein out of the oceans.
Tom?
So what are the consequences longer term of the 3 counties or communities, whatever it was, that voted for a ban on fracking? Is that going to have consequences for the state in a broader context? Or?
Well, I don't think so. I think that the first community that banned fracking was in Boulder County, a community called Longmont. And we looked at it, and the state sued Longmont. Because if you ban fracking, you're denying people that own those assets the right to access them. And trust me, as a governor, there is absolutely nothing worse you can do than to sue one of your municipalities. And you should see the social media, how much I'm hated in parts of Longmont. But I don't think we had a choice. Now, are we going to sue each one of them? Have 5 lawsuits going on simultaneously? That's a waste of, how many lawyers are in the room, right? You guys think it would be a great idea, right? Yeah, I see a couple of people putting both hands up. But it's not a good use of resources. So we're going to let that one lawsuit, and this is not something, this has been adjudicated before. They will lose. You can't, it's a taking. You can't take somebody's asset without compensation. So they'll almost certainly lose. Once they lose, then we will sue more rapidly the other communities, or more likely some oil company is going to sue them first. That's who's really got standing in the issue. But I think it begs the point. It's just like the secession talks that when we raised the renewable energy standard for the rural electrics, they're just huge pushback, and people wanted to secede. What that tells us is they didn't feel heard, and that maybe our process was wrong. We have to do a better job of going out there and listening to people. And I think in this case, I try to go back out every month or every 6 weeks, back up into Boulder County, and hear as clearly as I can and give them real facts that no one can argue with, right? Here's what we're going to do about methane. Here's what the setbacks we've done. One thing, you send people pictures of some of the most valuable real estate on earth in Beverly Hills, and behind that wood fence is an old pump jack, right? Because they've had oil and gas being produced out of Beverly Hills for 75 or 80 years. And it hasn't hurt anybody's property values. People get used to it. Again, done properly. It's an industrial process, but done properly, it doesn't have to be such a detriment to the community.
David?
Well, Governor, let me just say thanks to you for making the time to be with us here tonight, and thanks for being part of this.
Well, I could have
day.
never gotten into Stanford, so this is as close as I could get.
I might just say that the idea of secession is not just unique to Colorado. There have been 2 or 3 counties in Northern California that periodically threaten to secede and join with some Southern Oregon counties. Siskiyou County is one, Humboldt County, and to form the state of Franconia. So we know about this if we pay attention to what our northern.
Well, now that recreational marijuana is becoming more prevalent, they might have an economy.
They'll be fiscally viable. But listen, on a more serious note, I'd like to ask you, if you would please, to put on your hat as the presiding chair of the Western Governors Association and tell this audience, which I think probably doesn't know much about it, what the Western Governors Association is all about, how it works, and what are the issues that have been on its agenda during your time as the chair?
So the focus for us, and again, it's an interesting point in this country, and the country's always gone through these divisive, booms and busts where people can't get along, and you just go back and read, Gore Vidal's wonderful book on Aaron Burr. You see how heated it became and how outrageous people's behavior was back then as well. We're at one of those real bottoms right now in terms of people just can't even talk to each other in Washington. Governors get along great. It's remarkable. We all have to run an enterprise. Almost all of us have to balance our budgets every year. We can't go out and borrow more and more money. And we all have to find solutions for issues, the full gamut. So one of the ways we do that within the Western Governors, I'm also the vice chair of the National Governors Association, but we focus on, let's not try and prove anyone right or wrong. Let's try and figure out how, in business, your success comes from expanding the other person's perception of their self-interest, right? Getting them to see that their self-interest isn't this narrow self-interest that they thought they had, but really if all these other things happen, they're going to be much better off, even if it's more than what they really would have bargained for otherwise. So we look at that with the governors and say, all right, where are those places where we're not going to get into a fight over health care, right? We have a hard time, even as governors, talking about health care, although, Denver, we have a bipartisan health care exchange that we set up ourselves. We have Republican support as well as Democratic support. Is it working perfectly? No, but I think it's going to do fine. We're going to get it figured out in the next month or two. That is a more difficult conversation than water, than the condition of our forests, and how wildfires are now affecting. It's not just Colorado. I mean, California. Look at how many people want to live in the trees. right? Part of the Western ethic is you come out and you can be close to a job center, but you can live closer to nature and you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. That creates real issues about, the insurance industry and people's safety and our ability to deal with that, especially with drought issues and things that people tie to climate change. How do we deal with all that? And that comes to water, huge issue for us on the Western Governors this year, and energy. I think energy is a place, again, where we can try and create a regulatory environment that's consistent and rigorous, and we can take the states like Colorado that do have a real strong environmental push, and I think we can convince Utah and Wyoming and Texas and Oklahoma to accept our same environmental framework, because we did it with industry, right? I think everyone thinks it's pretty fair. We tried to do it, have the maximum benefit for the least possible cost, and industry's been right there along with it. So those are the main ones. Well, obviously, we talk about education to a certain extent, but we don't have the same consensus opportunity there. Governors are much more pragmatic and easier to get along with and generally tell much better jokes than people in Congress.
Sir, in the middle there.
Full disclosure, I represent Kansas in the lawsuit against Nebraska over water, and you're sadly a defendant in that case.
We had nothing to do with it. I just want to point out, we were delivering water beyond any.
And full disclosure, I grew up in Denver, and I'm a big fan of East High, class of '86. But what I'd like to talk about, building on what David said with the Western Governors Association, it seems like in many ways I've been to Western States Water Council meetings, offshoots of the Western Governors Association. And they typically are two-day conferences where the first day they welcome the federal representatives in, usually from the Bureau of Reclamation or EPA or the Department of Interior. And these poor federales come in and try and make friends with the governors. And that goes okay, and then they fly back to Washington that night. And the next day, you guys get back together. And in classic sort of Bernard DeVoto style, you crush the federales the next day. What idiots they are. Where did they come from? Now, I get paid to do interstate water litigation. I'm pretty happy about that. So maybe this is not in my best interests. But Brian and I were talking at dinner today about how, John Wesley Powell's original vision of building the West around its drainages. These river basins do not obey state lines, whether it's the Rio Grande, the Republican, the Arkansas, the North Platte, the South Platte. To what extent can the Western governors work with the federal government to impose a sort of basin-wide rationality on these water management challenges? Because if they can, I think people like me might go back to a more honest way of living, and there might be more waterway. But I think this is a real challenge. There's an opportunity for leadership from the governors using Washington, probably bringing in resources, bringing in expertise, and softening some of the partisan divides. And I'd just like your thoughts on that as a leader of the Western Governors Association.
Well, water is clearly, the great cliche in Colorado is that the whiskey is for drinking, water's for fighting. I think one of the problems with Western governors, historically, they come together, the federales come in, there's this friction, and then the next day they spend criticizing them and saying we're not going to pay attention. The governors haven't spent enough time saying, let's let the federal representatives not even show up for a meeting. Let's see what we can do ourselves, right? Let's set, when I was first ran for mayor of Denver, and Denver is a city of about 600,000 people surrounded by almost 2 million of suburbs, right? And yet Denver has all the senior water rights. Anytime there's a serious drought, Denver has nothing to worry about. Aurora to the east or Douglas County to the south, they're in big trouble. And all the old water buffaloes in Denver said, well, the suburbs wouldn't let us expand. When there's a drought, we'll fix their wagons. Their time's going to come, and we'll see who laughs last. And I'd be sitting there in their living room at a fundraiser saying, are you kidding? There's a drought, and Douglas County or Aurora suspend building permits, and that gets into Time or Newsweek or, Politico, that's going to affect the value of every person's home in the whole metropolitan area. In Denver as well. I mean, you're already joined at the hip. And when I got elected, each person we appointed to the board of Denver Water, and Denver Water covers half the metro area. So even though Denver's 600,000 people, Denver Water serves 1.3 million people. And so Denver Water, I appointed a board, and their first priority for each board member was conservation. And how do we do it? How do we do it fairly? In 5 years, we cut the per capita consumption of water in Denver by 20%. So no other city's ever done that in a non-drought year anywhere in the United States. Of course, it meant that if you reduce the amount of water you're selling as a utility, and you still got to replace your pipes and your pumps, that means the price per gallon has to go up 20%. Right? So all my wealthy donors who have big yards of bluegrass are calling me up and saying, hey, my water bill went up $2,500 a month, right? What happened, right? And I would say every time, they say we have it's our water. Why are we paying more for it? I say, well, maybe legally it's our water, but from a broader point of view, the reason your home is worth more than a home in Kansas, for instance, is because it's in Colorado, right? And because we have a history of Western economies, and we have ranches, and we have a secure source of food, and maybe it's our water, and that this is your partnership and your contribution to rural areas. I bet I had that conversation 100 times. Not one person ever fought back. They go, oh, I get it. Now I get it. I'm fine. And I think what we're trying to do with the state is get, again, that perspective towards a broader self-interest. It's not about how much for every nickel that I get, but what is our larger potential as a community. And I think we're getting there in Colorado, which is, again, never been done before. And if we can do it there, then I think it's possible to sit down. We went down, I got the Governor Brownback of Kansas and Dave Heineman, who's the governor of Nebraska. And when I had to build a brew pub in Omaha once, and I drive back and forth between Denver and Omaha back in the early 90s. And there's a thing called the crane migration that happens every spring. And they come up, and they come about, 600,000 or 800,000 cranes come in the space of about 6 weeks. And I stopped to look at the sunset. I guess I was stopping on the side of the road. I pulled off the road, and I didn't even notice it because it was dusk, and there was this undulating brown kind of surface. It was shoulder-to-shoulder birds, these brown cranes. And I just was spellbound and tried to time my trips ever since. So I convinced Governor Heineman, who'd never seen the crane migration, or Governor Brownback, to come and talk about water. We actually went to what was the name of that? Kearney, Nebraska, on the Platte River in northwest Nebraska, and saw the crane migration, went down. It was an unbelievable sight. We were all blown away. But then we sat and talked about, why are we fighting over this water, right? We should all have a conservation ethic. We should figure out how together we can get maximum water through all the different droughts and abundances. And I think we came away with we're going to do this, have that kind of meeting every year. We have to do that. The next step is to do that on a whole with all the Western governors on a regional basis. And I think it's hard, probably almost impossible, but the opposite of, it's the opposite of giddy up. Well, whatever. Opposite of whoa.
Well, David, we might have to invite Governor Brown back next year just for equal time. I guess we have time for one more question, if there is one. This gentleman here.
Maybe we can segue on your comment on water. You're talking a lot about fracking, but isn't water resources the principal issue in the Western states, and the ability of people to continue to live and population increases based on water resources?
Absolutely. Water is I'm not saying more, but equally important as energy in the West. Some people would argue it's more important. Two things, and people complain all the time about fracking uses all this water, you're taking it out of the hydrologic cycle. Well, the truth is, though, when you take that natural gas and you burn it, one of the what comes out is the basic carbon compounds and the carbon monoxide, but it also comes out H2O. And it generates a huge amount of water, much far orders of magnitude beyond what's used in fracking. So that's, there are a lot of arguments to use against fracking. That's not one of them. But it does bring up, I think, a legitimate issue, and this is the challenges. I mean, this is the 21st century. We should be finding ways to take the brines that come out with produced oil, the other fluids that are used in not just fracking, but all the drilling processes, and figuring out how to repurpose them. And how, right now, when we're doing what we call green completions, we require our oil and gas companies to recycle every gallon of water, right? With the fracking, when they're drilling, everything. They can't use evaporative pits to get rid of the water and then just kind of clean out the sludge. Everything's got to be recycled. And I think, ultimately, five years from now, that's going to be the requirement for drilling all over the West. It probably should be. Great. Wow.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Let's give a hand to
all.
Governor Hickenlooper.
I want to thank you very much, Governor Hickenlooper. And on behalf of CEPR and the Lane Center, I want to thank everyone for coming. But I first want to thank the staff, the teams of the Lane Center and CEPR's team for putting on this whole day, getting everything organized and all. It was a great team effort, so a round of applause for the team that put all this on. And I also want to thank David Kennedy, Bruce Kane, and John Chauvin for putting together a great program. And thank you all for coming. Have a good night.